I'm going to be talking about the longevity agenda from a social, cultural and behavioural perspective. And then we're going to be joined by excellent panellists to discuss the issue further before we go into the work stream. So really, we saw the sort of biology this morning, and my mind gets blown every time I think about that, because it's about what are the theoretical limits to age. But this is a statistical approach to what's happening to age. And this is taken from the UK government's Office for National Statistics, and it's looking at the probability of living to a certain age depending upon when you were born. And obviously the current generations, you've got a forecast, and you have a range of government forecasts that go from a slowdown of life expectancy to a sort of broad continuation of what we've seen. Now, the sessions this morning will say that, as the investors say, past performance is not a sign of future performance, that we could well see a complete step change. But even looking at this chart, I think it makes me sort of gulp, which is that the generation who are being born today have a very plausible prospect of living to 100. And the question is, how do we do that? Now, of course, that's a question that Linda Grattan and myself looked at in our 100-Year Life book that came out a couple of years ago. And I'm going to draw on some of those ideas. But really, the more I think about this topic, and I do, it's one of these topics, once you start getting into your brain, everything kind of revolves around, what is longevity? Are we seeing things in a different way? But really, this is ultimately about time. That's what this is about. Both the life expectancy we've got and the life expectancy to come, we have more time. And, of course, time, one approach you think is pretty obvious. But once you start to think a little bit about time, it becomes incredibly complicated, and you realise there's lots of pitfalls. And there's two ways that this is about time. The first is about how we structure it. If we are living longer, we will structure time differently. And the second one is how we think about it. And each of them, I think, are the big social challenge that we've got in the years ahead. So let me just start by looking at how we structure time. And this is a chart Linda will know well. We've taken it from the book. So Linda and I say in the book, let's ignore the first 20 years of life. Let's ignore the last 10 years of life. We'll give you a weekend. We'll give you some time to relax at the end of the day and beginning of the day. But let's call everything else productive hours, things you could be doing something with. And by productive hours, I don't mean necessarily working. Of course, if you live to 70, you have 125,000 hours. But if you're living to 100, you have nearly an extra 100,000 hours. So then the sort of question society has to answer is, what do we do with that extra 100,000 hours? Time is something actually of a social convention. In the 20th century, we invented the weekend. It didn't used to exist. We've invented bank holidays and the summer holidays. So we know we can reinvent time, and we did reinvent the structure of time in the 20th century because we created things like teenagers. Used to be a child and then an adult, and then we created teenagers. We created a thing called pensioners. We created a three-stage life in the 20th century. Education, work, and then followed by retirement. And of course, what we're seeing already is a lot of people adapting in different ways to longer lifespans. And I think you can see this in many, many different ways. I said that we invented teenagers in the 20th century, but there's something happening to people in their 20s. The age at which you take on the full gamut of adult responsibilities is now shifting for all sorts of different reasons, some negative and some positive. But the average age of first marriage now in the UK is 31, not 21 as it was 50, 60 years ago. In Sweden, the average age of first marriage is 36. You're now more likely as a woman in the UK in your 40s to have a child than if you're under 20, which is a staggering outcome that we've never seen before. We're seeing the number of people working after the age of 70 has doubled the last 20 years. And of course, while divorce rates are falling on aggregate, you're seeing dramatic increases in divorce in that plus 50 age groups. So we are already seeing people changing the life course. And this is what we mean here by how we structure time. And Laura's new map of life is about thinking this is about how we restructure our life. There's a lot of effort going in, I think, to try and change the parameters of a three-stage life to make it sustainable, to sort of push the retirement age back, to increase the savings rate or lower the pension. But actually, we probably need to rethink that three-stage life for reasons I'll explain. Now, the other thing is not about restructuring time, which is a big social challenge in the years ahead. It's also how we think about time and how we think about age. And we saw much discussion this morning of chronological age and biological age. We are, as a society, very obsessed by chronological age. If you ask someone how old you are, they say how many years there were since they were born. Now, that's kind of the crux of our problem here, because actually it's quite relatively modern, that focus on chronological age. It was only about 200 years ago, as government started to create reliable birth records, that we started to focus on chronological age as a measure of how old you were. For most of human history, people didn't know when they were born. They didn't know exactly how old they were. They didn't celebrate their birthdays. And the question of how old you were was answered probably to the nearest decade, which perhaps some of us still do, but also sort of kind of your stage of life, whether you were a mother or a grandfather, or kind of how fit and physically healthy you were. But once government started to focus on chronological age, society became very age-focused. Things like child labour laws were based around chronological age. When you left university or school was based around chronological age. And of course, the apotheosis of this was the invention of retirement age and the concept of old at 65. And we still think in those chronological terms. But of course, what's really happening is a change in our biological age. We are, on average, healthier for longer. Averages are very important here. There's lots of challenges in this space. But if you focus on the average, in general, what we're seeing is people are, at every age, on average, more healthy than they used to be. The relationship between chronological and biological age has shifted. Now, the economists in the room will know about real and nominal variables, but we're obsessed with nominal measures of age, not real measures of age. And that creates all sorts of challenges. One is age stereotypes. I said earlier that a 78-year-old today has a mortality rate of a 65-year-old in 1922. We're seeing data that 65 to 74-year-olds a decade ahead will be healthier than before. But we still cling to nominal age as telling us something about people's behaviour. Things like the old age dependency ratio, which define you as being old either over 65, form the bedrock of the ageing society story. There's more old people. There's more people aged over 65. But there's two things happening. There's more old people, and in a sense, we are younger for longer. So I want to draw a distinction between what I call the ageing society story and then the longevity effect. So the ageing society story is that as you get richer as a country, you see a fall in the birth rate, and people live for longer. Not necessarily healthier for longer, they're just living for longer. And of course what that means is that the average age of society increases. And indeed, the UK population has never been older than it is today. The average age of the UK population has never been as high as it is right now. And of course, this forms the underpinning of the ageing society story. There's lots of old people. Old people aren't very healthy or productive and have higher costs, which is obviously true. And so we have a major challenge. But that's all defined about chronological age. More people aged over 65. The second effect on the right is the longevity effect, which is how our aging is changing. Sort of 75 is the new 65, if you want to put it as crudely as that. And of course, the more people we can push down that longevity channel, the less we have a problem with an aging society. Now, of course, the balance of these two effects differs from country to country. In Japan, where the slowdown in the population growth is very dramatic, that left-hand side effect is very strong. But in the UK, actually, the longevity effect is tending to dominate compared to the aging effect. There is lots of potential if we change our social, cultural, and economic practices to make this a good thing. I'm always struck by the fact that we've turned the following result into a bad news story. On average, we're living longer and we're healthier for longer. How have we turned that into a very bad news story? There are undoubtedly problems with that, but there must also be opportunities. And the longevity effect is this healthier aging. Now, I said earlier that the average UK citizen has never been older. The average UK citizen has also never had such a low mortality rate. If you look at the average mortality rate, it does this. Average age of society is doing that. In other words, the average UK citizen has never been older, but has never had so long left to live. And it's not obvious to me you can call that unambiguously an ageing society effect. So what can we do, not just medically, but economically and socially, to promote healthy aging, to promote that longevity channel? Well, in our book, Linda and I focus on 4 key assets that you have to think about. Your financial assets, your productive assets, your skills and knowledge, your vitality assets, which is your health, mental and physical health, as well as your close relationships. And then the final one is your ability to deal with change. And when life was 70 years, we constructed a 3-stage life. Stage 1 was about building up your productive assets, stage 2 about your financial assets, and then you switch them into stage 3, which was retirement. You didn't have many transformations. But over a longer life, this 3-stage life cannot be stretched out. We calculate that if you're going to start work at 20 and you're going to live to 100 and you're only prepared to save 10% a year, you're retiring at 80. That's a 60-year career. And a 60-year career requires something very different. It needs a multi-stage life where you take time out to recharge your education, you take time out to recharge your health and your relationships, and you deal with transitions and transformations. So the 3-stage life is, we think, already breaking up. But of course, the 3-stage life forms the basis of our corporate practices and our government practices. Now, Laura talked about a new map of life, and I think this is the interesting challenge about longevity. It's about thinking about things in a different way. It's about a sequence of events where everything you do at every age provides a platform for the next age. And the challenge with longevity is it deals with everything. Just as the science side said we've got to stop thinking about the silos and think about age as this common denominator, so too with social change. How do we prepare our finances for such a long life? What are the new risks we have to deal with? How do we deal with that flexible savings profile that I need if I need to take some time out? The Health Secretary today talked about the health challenges and the importance of preventative medicine. Education is clearly not going to have to be something done at the beginning, but a whole lifelong activity. How do we learn in later life? Employment, of course, needs to have a massive change, not just around retirement, but also how we think about working and our health and our fulfillment over the life course. And then I put policy as a catch-all at the bottom, but this affects everything. This nominal approach to age is hardwired so deeply into our system, and the 3-stage life that emerged in the 20th century is so deeply embedded that restructuring is going to take a long while and require major social experimentation.